We're giving $3,600,000 to Haiti for pastry cooking classes, for cyber cafes, for dance focus groups, for male prostitutes. The president's saying, I don't think so. I don't think that the American people support giving their hard-earned money to male prostitutes in Haiti. So he's asking us to cut it out.
Senator John Kennedy just delivered a brutal indictment of Washington's spending priorities, exposing how taxpayer dollars are being funneled into projects overseas that many Americans would consider indefensible. Kennedy lays it out in plain terms, and what he reveals is staggering.
I want to say, Mr. President, next week, President Trump's going to send us over what's called a recision bill. What does that mean? Well, we've got a $7 trillion budget, okay? I don't know how much of that $7 trillion is waste, but every fair-minded person would have to agree that there's some money being spent in that $7 trillion that shouldn't be spent. It just shouldn't. It's wasted money. And so President Trump and this Congress made one of its objectives trying to reduce spending. Not spending that we need to reduce, but spending that needs to be reduced. I call it spending porn. And the president has sent us a bill. He's saying to Congress, I want you to reduce spending in the current budget by $9.1 billion. And let me tell you what the spending, what constitutes the spending I want to reduce. Well, first, $9.1 billion out of a $7 trillion budget, we're not talking about a lot of money here. We're talking about 0.1%. That's all. That's point one. Point two, you need to look at what the president's asking us to cut out. I'll just give you a couple of examples. I didn't make this up. The president is saying we're giving $3 million to Iraq to produce Sesame Street. Maybe we could use that money for something else. The president is saying we're giving $3 million to Zambia for circumcisions and vasectomies. The president's saying we don't need to do that. We've got other priorities. We're giving $500,000 to Rwanda to buy electric buses. The president is saying to us, Congress, we don't need to be spending the money on that. There are more important things. We're spending $67,000 to give insect powder to kids in Madagascar. I don't even know what insect powder is, but the president's asking us to cut it out. We're giving $3,600,000 to Haiti for pastry cooking classes, for cyber cafes, for dance focus groups, for male prostitutes. The president's saying, I don't think so. I don't think that the American people support giving their hard-earned money to male prostitutes in Haiti. So he's asking us to cut it out. He's asking us to reduce the budget by $833,000 because some of President Biden's bureaucrats gave a contract to transgender people, sex workers, and their clients in Nepal. The president's saying, I don't want to do that. And he's right. That's enough. You get the idea. That's why I call it spending porn. Triggers your gag reflex. You look at this stuff and you go, what in God's name? Who decided to do this? Well, Congress didn't. The bureaucrats did. It's money we appropriated, but we didn't tell them to go spend money, $833,000, and give to sex workers in Nepal. They just took the money we appropriated and used it for that. And so the president is asking us to do what's called a recision, to cancel the spending. Now, I have listened. I've been here 8 years, Mr. President, and I've listened to a whole bunch of people talk about the need to reduce spending. But you got to watch what people do, not what they say, because talk is cheap. And around here, I've learned pretty quickly that reducing spending, it's like going to heaven. I want to go to heaven. I bet you want to go to heaven, Mr. President. I bet our guests in the gallery want to go to heaven. But everybody wants to go to heaven. Raise your hand if you're ready to take the trip today. Most people, you are, sir, and I admire that. But most people want to live a little longer. And that's the way it is with reducing spending around here. I want to reduce spending. I support it, but not just yet. Because I've got this project. Well, and I've listened to that. And I've especially listened to it for the past 100 days. Go get them, President Trump. Reduce that spending. We're behind you 1,000%. Well, he has. He has. 0.1% he's asking us to reduce. And I'm not saying senators shouldn't ask questions and make some changes if they need to be made, but here's the bottom line. It is gut check time. It is gut check time. You either believe in reducing spending or you don't. And if you talk the game and say, let's reduce spending, and you vote against this bill, in my opinion, you ought to hide your head in a bag. Because you will be able to cut the hypocrisy with a knife. It's real, real hard, Mr. President, to preach temperance from a bar stool. It's gut check time. We need to pass this bill. I yield the floor, Mr. President.
Watch this. If you're wondering why millions of Americans no longer trust Washington, this speech from Senator John Kennedy explains it better than almost anything else happening in politics right now. Because once Americans actually hear where some of their taxpayer money is going, the reaction is immediate. Disbelief, frustration, and anger. Kennedy stood on the Senate floor and laid out example after example of federal spending that sounds completely detached from the everyday realities facing ordinary Americans. Millions for Sesame Street programming in Iraq, funding for electric buses in Rwanda, programs involving sex workers in Nepal, pastry cooking classes and dance focus groups in Haiti. And while Washington bureaucrats may see these as development programs or foreign aid initiatives, millions of taxpayers hear something very different. They hear a government that has lost touch with the people paying the bills. That's the real political power behind this speech. Americans are dealing with inflation that still hasn't fully disappeared. Families are paying more for groceries, gas, rent, insurance, and utilities. Interest rates have crushed homebuyers. Credit card debt is climbing. And at the same time, Washington continues spending at levels that would have been considered unimaginable just a generation ago. The federal government is now operating with a national debt so massive that most politicians barely even discuss the actual number anymore because it's politically inconvenient. Trillions in spending have become normalized. Deficits barely make headlines unless there's a debt ceiling fight. And through all of it, Americans keep hearing the same message from Washington. There's never enough money to fix problems at home. But then speeches like Kennedy's surface and people suddenly discover there's money for programs overseas that many of them never would have approved in the first place. That's why Kennedy's phrase, spending porn, resonates politically, even if it's controversial. He's describing the reaction voters have when they hear these examples. They look at the spending and immediately think, who approved this? Who thought this was a priority? Why are Americans funding these programs while their own communities are struggling? And Kennedy's larger argument is important here. He's saying Congress appropriates huge pools of money, but federal agencies and bureaucrats often decide how portions of that money actually get spent. In other words, lawmakers may approve broad funding categories, but unelected officials inside agencies have enormous discretion over where the money ultimately goes. Kennedy is arguing that this creates a system where ideological or politically fashionable projects quietly receive taxpayer dollars with little public scrutiny. That's where the recision package comes in. President Donald Trump is asking Congress to formally cancel roughly $9.1 billion in spending authority. And Kennedy makes a point of emphasizing how small that number actually is relative to the size of the federal budget. Out of roughly $7 trillion in annual spending, this is only a fraction of a percent. But politically, it's symbolic. Republicans are trying to show voters that at least some people in Washington are willing to challenge the culture of endless spending. Because for years, Americans have listened to politicians from both parties talk about fiscal responsibility, while the debt continues exploding higher no matter who controls Congress. Kennedy's trip to heaven analogy captured that perfectly. Everybody says they want to reduce spending. Everybody says they care about the debt. But the second actual cuts are proposed, suddenly every program becomes untouchable. That's been one of the defining frustrations among conservative voters for years. And this speech also connects to something much broader happening in American politics right now. Growing resentment toward the permanent federal bureaucracy. A lot of voters believe there's now an entire class of unelected officials, consultants, NGOs, and administrative agencies operating with priorities that are completely disconnected from the average American citizen. That perception has fueled a huge amount of populist anger over the last decade. Trump's political appeal has always been tied, in part, to the idea that he's willing to confront those institutions directly. Whether people support him or oppose him, many voters see him as somebody willing to challenge the system instead of protecting it. Kennedy's speech taps directly into that same frustration, and Republicans know this issue works politically because it creates a sharp contrast in priorities. The GOP argument is simple. Why is Washington spending money on activist programs overseas while American infrastructure is deteriorating? Cities are struggling with crime, veterans are waiting for care, and working families are being squeezed financially. Why does the government always seem able to fund international social programs, but claims it can't control spending at home? Democrats and defenders of foreign aid will argue these examples are being selectively framed for political effect. They'll say many of these programs are tied to diplomacy, humanitarian assistance, disease prevention, or strategic international relationships. They'll argue that foreign aid often represents a tiny portion of the federal budget and can serve long-term American interests abroad. And to be fair, there's often more complexity behind these programs than can fit into a short Senate speech. But politically, complexity usually loses to outrage. Most Americans aren't going to spend hours researching grant language or international development policy. They hear phrases like male prostitutes in Haiti or sex workers in Nepal connected to taxpayer dollars, and the reaction is instant. That's why clips like this spread so rapidly online. They confirm what many voters already suspect, that Washington's priorities are fundamentally out of alignment with the concerns of ordinary Americans. And the timing matters too. This debate is happening at a moment when confidence in major American institutions is already historically low. Trust in Congress is weak. Trust in the media is weak. Trust in government agencies has declined sharply over the last several years. So when Kennedy exposes spending examples like these, many voters are already predisposed to believe the system is broken. That's why this speech hit such a nerve. Because beneath the jokes and the one-liners, Kennedy was making a serious argument about accountability, about whether taxpayers still have meaningful control over how their money is spent, about whether government exists to serve citizens or bureaucracies, and about whether anyone in Washington is actually willing to say no to the endless cycle of spending that keeps growing year after year. At the end of the day, this wasn't just a speech about a few strange foreign aid projects. It was a speech about priorities, about trust, about whether Washington still understands the people footing the bill for all of this. And judging by the reaction online, a lot of Americans believe the answer is no. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments.